Germany is saying goodbye to nuclear power. Reactors representing almost half the country's nuclear capacity are due to be shut down by the end of this year. The remainder will be switched off during the course of 2022. It could be seen as the worst possible time to do it, with Europe battling an energy crisis. But the big switch off is being met with glee from anti-atomic activists.
These protesters are making their voices heard and have been doing so for decades outside a nuclear power plant in northern Germany. For over 35 years now, activists have been meeting up once a month to call for the reactor to be shut down. Today is the 425th meeting and the final time that they'll be here braving the elements. That's because the Blackout nuclear power plant, one of the most controversial in Germany, will be decommissioned at the end of the year. For pastor and protest co-founder Hans-Günther Werner, it's a day of mixed feelings. It is mainly a sense of relief that the nuclear power plant is finally history. We never imagined back then that we'd have to hold out for so long. The 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster prompted Germany to declare a nuclear phase-out by the end of 2022. But many countries continue to rely on nuclear power. This promotional film, made by the French nuclear industry, depicts it as clean and, above all, climate-friendly, a line of argument also favored by the country's president. To achieve our objectives, in particular carbon neutrality by 2050, we will, for the first time in decades, relaunch the construction of nuclear reactors in our country. Greenhouse gas emissions are lower than those from fossil fuels. But compared to wind or solar power, nuclear energy production is far more expensive.
It's really clear those countries around the world that are most intensely committed to civil nuclear power are either countries with nuclear weapons or countries really demonstrably keen on nuclear weapons.
The reactor will be shut down, but the radioactive waste will remain in storage there for decades to come. There's still no permanent disposal site anywhere in the world, which is why the activists plan to continue their fight.
Well, to understand what the nuclear phase-out means for Germany, let's just take a look at the country's energy mix. So in 2020, renewable energy sources like wind, solar, biomass and hydro had increased to make up 43.8% of Germany's power. But coal is actually the second most important source. Lignite and hard coal supply almost a quarter of Germany's electricity. The German government is, though, aiming to close all of its coal plants by 2038 as it reduces carbon emissions. Next up, gas-fired power stations provide 16.1% of Germany's electricity in 2020. Then we come to nuclear power plants, which generated 11.3%. But that is obviously about to change, with all of Germany's reactors due to be switched off by the end of 2022. Now, the world is watching Germany's energy transition as it aims to switch off sources currently providing almost 40% of its electricity. That's nuclear and coal. Critics say that it could be too soon and could even lead to blackouts, especially when it's dark and there are no winds blowing and there is no sun. They suggest that keeping nuclear power plants running as a stable source of energy is the best thing to do. Well, let's discuss this a little bit further with Michael Schneider, who is lead author of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report and an opponent of nuclear power. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us on DW Business. So what do you say to that suggestion that this is, with Europe suffering an energy crunch, the worst possible time to be turning off energy sources?
Well, you know, I mean, the German nuclear phase-out has been in the making for a long time. It's been decades that the German society has been discussing the issue. By the way, the term like Energiewende, which now has been integrated into the English language, like energy transition, dates from 1980. And, you know, as soon as 1986, when the Chernobyl disaster took place, Germany had actually published, in Germany, there were 20 nuclear phase-out scenarios published. So there's a long exercise of thinking and designing this nuclear phase out. So what is happening now is just a consequence of these latest decisions that are now 10 years old. So there was a long period of preparation for that. And let's face it, it's been a phenomenal investment security. You can, imagine you can invest into other electricity generating technologies knowing that 4,000 megawatts will switch off by the end of the year. That's a phenomenal investment security that doesn't exist in the same way in other countries.
But something we do need to bear in mind when we talk about when we talk about the switch off of the nuclear power is the environmental impact and the fact that Germany's renewable sources aren't quite ready to make up for what's going to be lacking from the nuclear switch off. Is this actually a bad move for the environment, given that Germany will be using coal to make up that loss?
No, that's the myth, and that's the problem. The reduction in nuclear output over the past 10 years has been compensated for twice over by the increase in renewable energy sources. So it's a myth that actually has led to more coal. No, it's actually...
But it will in the coming years. It is accepted that it will mean there is more coal and lignite being burnt to make up for the loss of nuclear power over the next few years because wind and sun are not ready to fill that gap.
No, it's actually not true. I mean, there's a very clear pathway now in order to double up the speed of implementation of renewable energy sources. And in fact, the new coalition has a target for 2030 to phase out coal differently from what was said earlier. So to bring it further closer to now, originally it was 2038, and have by 2030 80% of renewables in the electricity mix. So in fact, what we have in Europe is that especially France is worried about the nuclear phase-out because Germany and Belgium, the two nuclear phase-out countries, have actually saved the French grid in the last week when the thermometer dropped below zero. So we actually have a quite unique situation where nuclear France is depending on the nuclear phase-out countries in order to stabilize its grid.
We do have this unusual situation, don't we, in Europe, where we have Germany on one hand phasing out and France, if anything, wanting there to be more nuclear power plants across Europe. Why do we have that enormous difference?
Well, you see, in France, there has been always a myth of la grande nation, that France can only be as powerful and as radiating in the world with nuclear weapons and with nuclear power. And frankly, France has always used the nuclear technology, whether on the military side or on the civil side, as geopolitical tool. So don't forget, there is now a presidential election coming up. France has taken over the presidency in the European Union at 1st of January. So there's alliance building. So again, once again, France uses nuclear power as a geopolitical tool. So, but on the other hand, don't forget that the new nuclear power plants that the president has been talking about, we're talking of a grid connection between 2040 and 2050. So, which is sort of a bit late for the environment, and it's a bit late for changing the situation in terms of power generating sources.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Michael Schneider. I do appreciate you giving us so much of it. That's Michael Schneider from the World Nuclear Industry Status Report on DW Business.